All right, today's our class. We're going to look at Deborah and Barak. It's kind of our first case study, our first actual account of people that were judges. So Deborah is our judge, and looking to see how Deborah works. And one of the neat things I think about this section is that Deborah calls Barak to help, calls Israel to help. There's just this great cry for help from everybody that can help in Israel to come up and to fight against the Canaanites. And the test is, do you come up, or did they come up to fight against the Canaanites? That's the test. And there's in chapter 4, we read of the history of Deborah and Barak. And then in chapter 5 of Judges, we read of the song of Deborah and Barak. And a big part of the song of Deborah and Barak is commending the people that came up to help. And a big part of the song is about talking about the people that didn't. And we were talking to the young people in our class, and we talked about, can you imagine if there was a song that was written and you were in that song and you're one of the people that didn't come up and help? And it was noted that you were, or your ecclesia was, or your area was, your tribe was one of the tribes that didn't come up and help to fight against the Canaanites. We're going to start with Barak, and Barak has some hesitation in whether or not he's going to fight with the Canaanites. And I think this goes well with the theme that we've been looking at this week, because on the first day we looked at understanding what Canaanite thinking was. I think we saw pretty clearly that that was basically men doing what was right in their own eyes, following the frog-like spirits, as our brother Stephen talked about this morning. We talked about different ways that we can fight against Canaanite thinking. And then we talked about the different aspects of the judges yesterday, how there's the aspect of pointing out what God's rules and God's commands are, but there's also the aspect of going out and saving your brother and doing everything that you can to help them, because we're going to mess up. We're going to get into situations which are difficult. We're going to do the wrong thing. We're going to leave the Canaanites in our life. We need all the help that we can get. So that's where Deborah and Barak come in today, and they call for help, and they get some help from some, and others don't bother coming to help in the fight. So let's take a look at Judges chapter 4. And we're going to start out right at verse 1. It says, "And the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of Yahweh when Ehud was dead. And Yahweh sold," again we've got this idea of selling a slave. Yahweh sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. He said, Israel, you can be Jabin, the king of Canaan's slave for a while, and see how that works out for you. He reigned in Hazor. He was a captain whose host was Sisera, which dwelt in Harosheth of the Gentiles. We're going to do a little bit of map work today, so let's start out with that. Here's a picture of Israel. This is in northern Israel. You've got, working with my new pointer here, it's a little tricky. Here's the Sea of Galilee right here. Here's where Jabin was, king of Canaan in Hazor. And here's where Sisera was with all of his forces. And of course, you know the Kishon River is the important river in this story. And there's where Mt Tabor is. So that should give you a good picture of the geography of what we're going to be looking at here. Sisera comes out from Harosheth Hagoyim, or Harosheth of the Gentiles, as it is in the King James Version. So the children of Israel are being oppressed now. And it says in verse 3, "And the children of Israel cried unto Yahweh." So just what God wanted them to do. He wanted them to get to this point where they said, this master is not the master that we want. This is not working out the way that we thought that it would, because he has 900 chariots of iron. Now, think about in your life, think about a situation where you allowed a few Canaanites or some Canaanite thinking into your life. That's what Israel did. Israel allowed that, and they woke up one morning, and those few Canaanites were now 900 chariots of iron. And they couldn't do anything about it. They were desperate now because they allowed that Canaanite influence into their life, and now it became something that was insurmountable to them. And it says, "And 20 years he mightily oppressed the children of Israel." So this challenge that they had went on for 20 years. And they weren't doing anything about it. And they weren't working together is what ends up being the case here in order to deal with it. And they didn't look to God for deliverance. Now, what we're going to find out here is the circumstances of the ecclesia that resulted, the circumstances of what Israel was like. And there were basically three problems that they were facing at the time. If you come with me over to chapter 5, so now we're into the song of Deborah and Barak. There's some comments given to us, or some phrases given to us that give us an idea of what it was like living in Israel during the time of Deborah, Barak, and actually it says in here the times of Jael, which is the same time period. So Judges 5 verse 6, it says, in the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were unoccupied, and the travelers walked through byways. So the highways of Israel were unoccupied. You couldn't take the highways. It wasn't safe to travel on the main roads of Israel, so people couldn't communicate. The tribes were separated by this transportation handicap, if you will. And you couldn't take the roads because there were so many robbers on those roads that you just couldn't do it. And so people would travel by the byways or the back roads or the back trails. And so the economy of Israel was devastated. It was really tough for the tribes to work together to solve problems. They didn't know their fellow Israelites because you couldn't travel from tribe to tribe very easily. And so the bond between brethren was being worn down. It was being broken. The bond and the trust was going away, and the people just didn't know each other, and so they didn't have confidence in their brothers and sisters in the other tribes or in the other cities. And there started to be factions in Israel at this point in time. And we find that very clearly as we go through this chapter because of the separation that took place. So we start with our first issue, the issues that they faced, and that was that cooperation between the tribes was almost impossible because of this transportation problem. And spiritual progress was drastically reduced. Now, when we want to communicate with a brother or sister, we can get on the phone, we can email them, and we can communicate with them. For them, they couldn't do that. And so in between the tribes, there was just this separation that was building and making things even more difficult. Same thing, I think, happens in the ecclesial world. If we don't have relationships with people in our ecclesia, if we don't have relationships between ecclesias, these divisions begin to build, and we start to have problems with those types of divisions. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Let's take a look there for just a second to get an idea of how this worked. In Paul's day, he writes to the Corinthian ecclesia, and you'll be familiar with a lot of the different problems that the Corinthian ecclesia was facing. They were having trouble with how they kept the Lord's Supper, how they kept the feast of the breaking of bread. They were having trouble with brethren going and to law against each other. They were suing each other. They were having problems with sexual immorality, and they weren't able to deal with it. There were a lot of different problems that the ecclesia faces in Corinth, and they couldn't deal with them because there were so many factions in the ecclesia, so many different people that sided not based upon the right decision, but based upon their own group or their own people that they were familiar with. So 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul writes to them and he goes through his greetings with them. And then he gets right to the key problem that they're going to need to solve if they're going to be able to move forward and actually start to work on the problems. He says, now I beseech you, brethren, 1 Corinthians 1 and 10, I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye all speak the same thing. There be no divisions among you, but that ye are perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. You remember Paul talked about the fact that some people said, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. Those were those divisions that were taking place. And Paul says, if you're going to be able to fight against those, we've got to get together and we've got to work together. We've got to have trust with each other if we're going to deal with these problems. Well, that's what was happening in Israel. That's exactly the situation that was happening with them. They couldn't solve the problems because they didn't have confidence in each other, and they didn't have trust that their brother would come through if they had a need or a problem that they needed to handle. Judges chapter 5 again. Second problem that they had, the leaders weren't doing anything to help the people. So let's look at Judges chapter 5, verse 7. and I don't particularly like the King James Version because it's hard to understand. It says, the inhabitants of the villages ceased. The RV says, the rulers ceased in Israel. The RV says, the rulers ceased in Israel. They ceased in Israel until that I, Deborah, arose, that I arose a mother in Israel. We saw yesterday the importance of having leadership, of giving direction to the people. And we saw that when the judges stopped teaching, that there was a real problem. And that's what was happening in this time period. There just weren't any leaders that were standing up in the ecclesia defending the truth and showing people the way that they should go, which is what a judge should be doing. But of course, there was Deborah. She does a tremendous job, really a tremendous job in this chapter. So Judges 5 verse 8 brings us to the next one. It says they chose new gods. Right? They decided to face their lives, to point their lives and use their lives and their time for other things other than for God. It says there was war in the gates. Was there a shield or a spear seen among 40,000 in Israel? So here you've got them, and they've got no weapons. They've got no way to defend themselves, even though they've got all these Canaanites. And the Canaanites have 900 chariots of iron, but they're not doing anything to fight against it. Sometimes I think about our fight against the world, that sometimes we are not as well armed as we should be, and that the world has all the weapons to come against us. Well, that's the way that it was with Israel at this time period. It says the people chose new gods, and they had absolutely no defenses against it. They weren't spending time in the scriptures or on a spiritual level. They didn't know what was right or what was wrong, and so they didn't know what to do. And there was no one that stood up to actually do it. That is, of course, until Deborah stands up. So let's look at Judges chapter 4, verse 4 now, and let's see how Deborah reacts and what she does. It says, and Deborah, a prophetess. There's a teacher. There's somebody that's going to set people straight as to what's right and what's wrong. There's a judge. The wife of Lapidoth, she judged Israel at that time. And she dwelt under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in Mount Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. So you see, that's just like what happened with Moses. The people would come to her, and she would give them judgment. And she was a prophetess, like Miriam and like Huldah. She would teach the people at the same time. She was exactly what Israel needed at this point in time. And we're told in chapter 5, verse 7, we looked at it a second ago. I think we looked at it a second ago. We're told that she was a mother in Israel. What does that mean, that she was a mother in Israel? That means all of Israel looked to her, thought of her as though she was their mother. And that means that she considered all of Israel to be like her children. That's the kind of person she was. She thought, I'm responsible for all these people. I've got to make sure all these people are delivered, and I've got to handle the situation, and I've got to get to work in order to do it. Just an absolutely wonderful judge. So we look at her more and more closely. In verse 6, it says, she sent and she called Barak, the son of Abinoam, out of Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, hath not Yahweh Elohim of Israel commanded, saying, go and draw toward Mount Tabor, and take with thee 10,000 men of the children of Naphtali and of the children of Zebulun? And he says to himself, are you crazy? Are you crazy? You want me to take 10,000 men and go up on top of that mountain? Why would that be an absolutely terrible idea, to go up on top of Mount Tabor right there? What would happen? What would Sisera do as soon as they went up on top of that mountain? He'd bring his 900 chariots of iron, and he'd surround that mountain, and it would be over for them. It would be the end, because he'd just have to wait them out, and if they ever tried to come down, it would be easy to just pick them off and to kill them. That was a strategically terrible thing to do. probably the worst thing they could possibly do in fighting against the Canaanites with their 900 chariots of iron. But that's what she says. She says, I want you to go, and I want you to take 10,000 men and to go up on top of that mountain. Her plan was really based upon 3 phases. First of all, Barak would take his 10,000 men and go up on top of Mount Tabor. It's 1,300 feet above the surrounding plain. And he would take those men and he would wait on top of that mountain. Then, there's another picture of that mountain from above. You see the open space all around it. You could just see that there's nothing, and it would be just really easy to surround it. Incidentally, it would probably take about 900 chariots to surround it, so that was quite convenient. He would be able to surround that, and it would be a big problem for Barak if that actually happened. The second part of it was that Deborah would then bring her forces that she'd gathered from Ephraim and the other tribes against the cities of the Canaanites. And there were some fortresses, there were some other cities that she would bring her forces up and attack while he was on top of the mountain, while Barak was on top of the mountain with his forces. And then, of course, then the map, of course, we have a picture of how that would go. Now, this is not quite actually the map of what her plan was. This is actually a map of what actually happens. So picture this map with this arrow right here being added later. So what you'd have is you'd have Barak, his 10,000 men, and they would be all right there on top of Mount Tabor. And then you'd have Sisera and his men, and they'd bring their forces, their chariots, down here, and their plan would be to then surround Mount Tabor. It's hard to get my circle right here. But they would surround Mount Tabor and kill Barak if he tried to come down. That's what would happen. But the plan here was that he would go up there, they would come down, and then God would bring the floods and destroy them in the river. So that would be the next phase. Yahweh would sweep them away by flooding the Kishon River. Great plan, I think, as long as you're not on top of the mountain. Really a great plan, as long as you're not the one that's stuck up there, because what happens? What would be the danger? What would be the danger in that case? You'd run out of food eventually, absolutely. What would happen if the other tribes never came to help you in this battle? What would happen if you went up on top of this mountain and this other force that was supposed to come, right? Because the other force was supposed to come from down here, from Mount Ephraim, where Deborah was from. They were supposed to come up and engage as well. But what would happen if they never showed up? And what would happen if it never started raining? What would happen to Barak? He'd starve. His 10,000 men would be killed in this case. So Barak is reliant now on his brothers and sisters. And he's reliant on God. Because if it never floods, they have a big problem because these chariots make it here and surround the mountain. And if Deborah's forces never come and attack Tanakh and Megiddo and probably Harosheth of the Gentiles, while Sisera's forces are all gone, same problem. They're stuck here on the top of the mountain. So Barak is in really a difficult situation when Deborah comes to him and says, here's the plan. You're going to go up on top of the mountain, and you're going to wait on top of the mountain, and then we're going to come, and I'm going to bring the rest of Israel, and we're going to help you, and God's going to flood the river Kishon, and everything's going to work out great. You're Barak, you're thinking, this sounds good for you, but this does not sound good at all for me. So Barak's a bit hesitant, but we know that Barak has faith. How do we know that? How do we know that Barak has faith? How do we know anybody has faith? Well, many people have faith. Yeah, okay, good call. He followed her advice and did it, so obviously he does, right? Hebrews chapter 11. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. He's one of those guys. Not a lot of detail. We don't know exactly why his faith is commended, but he's in that list of people that had faith. Hebrews 11:32, it says, "And what shall I say more? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and Jephthah, and David, and Samuel, and of the prophets." So he's one of the faithful. He's commended for his faith in this case. So Barak then, if we come back to Judges chapter 4, Barak says, "I'm terrified of being on top of that mountain by myself. I'm afraid that the rest of the Israelites aren't going to come up and help." So he says, "If thou wilt go with me, then I'll go. If you'll come with me, then I'm willing to go up on top of that mountain and risk my life." Now, why would that help? Why would just having Deborah with him help? Well, first of all, Deborah's plan was to bring her forces from Ephraim with her up on top of that mountain. But Barak was thinking, what if they never show up? And he's thinking, what if the rest of Israel never shows up? But what if this mother of Israel, the woman that everybody in Israel respected, the woman that everybody in Israel loved, was also on top of that mountain? What would the people of Israel think then? They would come for sure. And what else would he have confidence would happen? That it would start raining, right? Because Deborah was there with him on top of that mountain. So you could see the hesitancy, I think, that Barak had in going to fight. He's a man of faith, but man, there's just too many things in the way of me going up on top of that mountain, Mt Tabor, with 10,000 men. So he says in verse 8, "If thou wilt go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go." And she says, "Surely I will go with thee. Notwithstanding, the journey that thou takest shall not be for thine honor, for Yahweh shall sell Sisera into the hand of woman." And who was that woman? Of course, that was Jael, right? He was going to sell Sisera. He was going to sell Sisera, as in making Sisera Jael's slave, as in making the captain of the Canaanite host the lowest of servants. Because that's what Jael's going to do in this chapter. She's actually going to make this captain of the Canaanites the lowest of servants, which is exactly what you're supposed to do to a Canaanite. So verse 10, it says, "And Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and he went up with 10,000 men at his feet." So he had 10,000 men that he was the leader of. They were following him. And Deborah went up with him. Next, we have a little aside, because the real heroine of the chapter is Jael, isn't it? We have a little aside about Jael, verse 11. It says, "Now Heber the Kenite." What do you remember about the Kenites? Where did the Kenites come from? Well, it tells us, which was of the children of Hobab, Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. It tells us that these are the same people that had decided to camp, you remember, with the tribe of Judah because of their faithfulness with Caleb in Caleb's time. It says that he had severed himself from the Kenites. So Heber had decided that he was no longer going to pitch his tent in that direction. He was going to move away from there. It says he pitched his tent unto the plain of Zaanaim. Now, we're going to find this word tent comes up frequently in this story, following back or going back to the prophecy of Noah, I believe, and the destruction or the curse on Canaan. So it says that he pitched his tent in the plain of Zaanaim. So he pitches his tent away from Israel, away from the faithful people, because Heber has decided that he's going to go the way of the Canaanites as well. And he pitches his tent just like Lot pitched his tent towards Canaan. Now, the passage underlines this, and you don't see it at first, but if you look up what this name Zaanaim means, Zaanam actually means to move one's tent. It actually means that. So what you have here is you've got Heber, who's a man that was a Kenite, and the Kenites had moved their tents to be in the region of Israel because of the faithfulness of Israel, because they wanted to be a part of that. And you got Heber, who decides he does not want to be a part of that anymore. His sojourn among the tents of Shem is over, and he's going to move his tent now to Zaanam, which means to move one's tent. And you're thinking, wow, there's a lot going on here. This is a very significant passage that we're looking at. Something really important is going to be happening here because of this allusion back to what Noah's prophecy was. Okay, so while all this is going on, while he's moving, while he's gone to be on the side of the Canaanites, while Barak is deciding, yes, I'm going to go up, the cry goes out to all the tribes, well, at least most of the tribes of Israel, to come and help. And they're called to help. Barak is willing. He's convinced now. He's on board. He's going to help. The rest of the tribes now get the call to come and help. What do you think it would be like if your ecclesia sent out the call to other ecclesias around it and said, hey, we have something that we think is really going to be effective in fighting against worldliness, against sin. We would like you to come and help us for this week, for this weekend, for this evening even. What do you think the response would be to that? Some people would go, and some people would not go. Well, that's exactly what happens here, and that's exactly what's recorded for us. This record of the participation of the different tribes. So Judges chapter 5, the Song of Deborah and Barak, celebrates those people that go and doesn't celebrate those people that refuse to go or fail to go. So Judges 5 verse 14, it says, out of Ephraim there was a root of them against Amalek. So it's telling us that out of Ephraim, the people came to fight against the Canaanites. So all the way, where's Ephraim? Ephraim is right down here. So Deborah was from there, so we would expect her to come and her people to come and to fight right up there is where Tabor is. So we would expect them to come and help. It says, after thee, Benjamin among thy people. So the people of Benjamin, they also come to the help to the aid of Barak in this battle that takes place. It says, out of Machir or out of Manasseh came down governors. So which Manasseh? We believe it's this Manasseh because we're told that those from Gilead did not come in just a couple of verses. So Manasseh, Western Manasseh, if you will, comes. Kind of jumpy on my pointer. But Western Manasseh comes, and it says that the governors were the ones that came. They're the rulers. Now, the rulers wouldn't typically go forth to battle, but in this case, they do. And they go out to fight. It says, out of Zebulun. Zebulun's right there. Of course, Zebulun had to go. It was right in their backyard where this takes place. Zebulun went, and it says, they that handle the pen of the writer went out of Zebulun. So the scribes went. Why would the scribes go? Well, this was such an important event. This was such an important thing that everybody went. Maybe they also went to record what happened because it was going to be such a momentous event. It was really momentous because the whole of Israel was working together, or I should say a whole. Most of Israel, or much of Israel, was working together in this endeavor. So they go out and they get involved in the fight. Verse 15, it says, the princes of Issachar were with Deborah. So the princes went. Even Issachar and also Barak. He was sent on foot into the valley. So Barak ends up going on foot into the valley when Sisera is finally, his chariots are bogged down. But then we get to Reuben. Reuben is way down over here. And the battle's going to be way up here. And what does Reuben do? It says, for the divisions of Reuben, there were great thoughts of heart. They gave it a lot of thought. They discussed what they were going to do. Should we go? Should we not go? Should we go? Should we not go? Should we go? Should we not 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 go? It says, why abodest thou among the sheepfolds? To hear the bleating of the flocks? So this great battle is going on, and Reuben is staying with the flocks. And the song makes fun of them and says, did you do that because you wanted to hear the bleating of the flocks? It says, for the divisions of Reuben there were great searchings of heart. You can imagine an AB meeting, maybe a couple of AB meetings. Should we go up and help? That's really a long ways away. I don't know that those Canaanites are ever going to be a threat to us. Some people might get killed. Some people might be hurt. Is this really our battle? Should we go up and help? Doesn't appear like they ever go to help. James chapter 2:15, I think, is a great verse to put in the margin next to that. Because it's really easy for us to have faith without works, is what James' point is. It's really easy for us to have faith without works. But if we do, then what does that say about our faith? That it's dead, that there's not much faith there at all. So James chapter 2, verse 15, it says, if a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give not those things which are needful to the body, what does it profit? So if you're not going to help each other with the needs, the everyday needs that we have, what good is it? If you're like Reuben and you're not going to go help when your brother's in trouble, what good is it? He says, even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. So they had good intentions, it would seem, because they talked about it. But in the end, it seems like they stayed with the sheep. They didn't go. They didn't help. How'd you like to be in the song of Deborah and Barak and be Reuben in that song? Right? And the rest of the tribes later on are celebrating the great victory, but they talk about your tribe as being one of the tribes that didn't get around to doing anything about the Canaanites. Verse 17, it says, Gilead abode beyond Jordan. We talked about that. So this region up here, they just stayed, right? They're on the other side of the Jordan. Chariots crossing the Jordan River. Not a big deal. We're going to be fine over here. It says, why did Dan remain in ships? And Asher continued on the seashore. Asher right at the top. Right here. Right? Again, what good are chariots of iron against ships? They're fine. We're just going to stay up here. We don't need to worry about it. And abode in his breaches or in his creeks. How'd you like to have a song written about you discussing that? You decided that, you know what, that the problem that the ecclesia is having is a problem that really doesn't affect me. Maybe it's the CYC. Maybe the CYC is really, really struggling. And you think, well, that's not something I could do or should do because I don't have kids in CYC. Really doesn't affect me. Not going to work, is it? It's not what God wants to hear. It's not what God is looking for. Verse 18 says, Zebulun and Naphtali were people that jeoparded their lives unto the death in the high places of the field. High places of the field. They went up on top of Mt Tabor. They risked their lives in this case. They went up with Barak. Have you ever been a part of an ecclesial project where not too many people showed up? Right? You had something planned and not very many people in the ecclesia showed up. Maybe you planned the event. How did you feel when just about nobody came to help, or very few people came to help out with the project? And you know the project would have been a benefit not just to your family, but it would have been a benefit to everybody. And yet some of them don't show up. These chapters make it very clear how important it is for us to show up. How important it is for us to help each other at every opportunity that we possibly can. There's another factor. What if you don't show up and you have children or grandchildren? What will your children think if there's something that's going on and you didn't show up? So we asked the question earlier about Barak. Did Barak have a legitimate fear that people wouldn't show up and help him on top of the hill, top of Mt Tabor? He certainly did have a legitimate fear. And maybe the results were as good as they were because Deborah went with him. I wonder what the results would have been had Deborah not gone with him up on top of that mountain to fight against the Canaanites. Let's go to chapter 4, verse 12. So Barak's on top of the mountain. Some people have come to help. It's starting to rain, probably. It says, verse 12, and they showed Sisera that Barak the son of Abinoam was gone up to Mount Tabor. And Sisera is all excited. Why on earth would his enemy do that? He's got them, he thinks. He's just itching to go out and to fight against Barak and to just get rid of him completely at this point in time. Verse 13 says, Sisera gathered together all his chariots, even 900 chariots. So he takes them all. Every one of them he takes. It says, and all the people that were with him, he takes all of them. And he goes out of Harosheth of the Gentiles and he heads towards Mount Tabor with them unto the river Kishon. He's fully committed now, completely committed to this battle. He takes everything that he has with him. Verse 14, and Deborah said unto Barak, up. She says, get up, arise, for this is the day which Yahweh hath delivered Sisera into thine hand. Okay, you're Barak. How do you feel now? Still a little bit iffy about going down that mountain because you know those chariots are waiting. Maybe it is starting to rain and maybe that's giving you some confidence, but you're still wondering. But we know that he has faith. And Deborah says, get up, arise. If you turn over to Judges chapter 5, verse 12, that makes it into the song. Arise, Barak, and lead thy captivity captive. Oh no, that's an echo, isn't it, in Scripture? Leading captivity captive. That's mentioned in Psalm 68, commenting about Moses leading Israel out of Egypt. And of course, that's mentioned about Christ, leading us out of sin. So there's great significance to what's happening here. Arise, Barak, and lead thy captivity captive, thou son of Abinoam. Is not, and then we go back to chapter 4, verse 14, Is not Yahweh gone out before thee, Deborah says. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor, and 10,000 men after him. And he's leading his captivity captive. He's a leader. He's what Israel lacked. He's a leader. And many people came to help him in this case. Judges 5, verse 19 says, the kings came and fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan. The idea behind this is that the kings of Canaan were so confident in this battle. They were so confident as they marched out of Harosheth. They were confident that they were going to defeat Barak and Israel. It says in Tanakh, by the waters of Megiddo. So they had their strongholds where the battles were fought. They were confident that they were going to win. And then it says they took no gain of money. So they had all this confidence as they went out. And yet this time, when they came back from the battle, they brought nothing. There was no spoil. They wouldn't take a spoil at all from this battle because the chariots, in this case, were absolutely of no use to them at all. Judges chapter 4, verse 15, back to the story. It says, and Yahweh discomfited Sisera and all his chariots, and all his host, with the edge of the sword before Barak. And so they went out and they just slaughtered the Canaanites in this case, so that Sisera lighted down off his chariot and he fled away on his feet. The chariots were bogged down because of the rain and the flooding of the river, and there was nothing that they could do about it but to fight on foot. It says, but Barak pursued after the chariots and after the host unto Harosheth of the Gentiles, and all the host of Sisera fell upon the edge of the sword, and there was not a man left. There was not a man left except for Sisera. But he's going to be taken care of in just a minute. But chapter 5 tells us of one particular Israelite village, Meroz. And that village, even after this incredible victory, even as it was taking place, they refused to help in the work of Yahweh. They refused to help their brothers. Judges 5, verse 23. And it tells us what happens when we fail to help in the work of God. It says, curse ye Meroz, said the angel of Yahweh. Curse ye bitterly the inhabitants thereof, because they came not to the help of Yahweh, to the help of Yahweh against the mighty. You know, we look at it and we think, well, they didn't come and help their brethren. We can picture this village where people, the Canaanites were maybe running past it, and they could easily have gone out and captured them and destroyed them as they should have. But they let them keep on going by, and they didn't help their brothers and sisters in the fight against the Canaanites. That'd be like us knowing that there's a problem that our brother or sister has, and just letting it continue and not doing anything about it to help them out. Curse ye, bitterly cursed, it says, of these people. And it doesn't say because they didn't help their brother. It says because they didn't help Yahweh. Because guess what? That's what helping our brother actually is, isn't it? It's helping Yahweh. It's sacrificing ourselves. It's agape love, sacrificing ourselves to do the work of God, which is helping our brothers and our sisters. So that village is completely cursed, is cursed by God because they refuse to go out and to help. 4 verse 17, it says, howbeit, Sisera fled away on his feet to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. There was peace between them. They had an alliance. Heber had made this alliance, but Jael had not. Jael had not made this alliance. So here's a man that's moved away from the ways of God, and his wife remains faithful and is a tremendous example for us, is a tremendous example for sisters as well, for the fact that she had her husband taking her family away from God, and yet she, in the very tent, takes Sisera and crushes his head and destroys him. A great comparison to Genesis 3:15. But this sister doesn't just let the family drift away from God. This sister takes things into her own hands and defeats Canaan and makes Canaan the lowest of servants in her own house, in her own tent, I guess I should say in this case. And she remains faithful. Verse 18, it says, and Jael went out to Sisera and said to him, turn in, my lord, turn in to me, fear not. And when he had turned in unto her into the tent, She covered him with a mantle. She invites him into her tent. She says, I'm going to do what's right for my family. I'm going to do what's right, and I'm going to help God. And he says to her, give me, I pray thee, a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty. And she opened a bottle of milk and gave him drink and covered him. Again, he said to her, stand at the door of the tent, and it shall be when any man doth come and inquire of thee and say, is there any man here? Thou shalt say, no. Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a nail of the tent and took a hammer in her hand and went softly unto him and smote the nail into his temples and fastened it to the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. And so he died. She crushed his head right there in the tent. She made him the lowest of servants. He was a cursed Canaanite, and she made him exactly what he'd been cursed to be, which was the lowest of servants, taking sin and doing exactly what God did to the serpent, making it the lowest of animals, the lowest of creatures, right on the ground, and she crushes his head. Genesis 3:15 says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, it shall crush thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Jael knew exactly what needed to be done. No one has to tell her. She just does it. No matter how dangerous. In her own tent, in a tent that had been taken away from Israel, she does this. She bruises the head of sin in her family. And what does the song say about Jael? Judges chapter 5, verse 24. Blessed art thou above women, shall Jael the wife of Heber the Kenite be. Blessed above women. Blessed shall she be above women in the tent. And the ESV there says, blessed, it says for the last phrase, of tent-dwelling women, most blessed. Isn't that fantastic? This woman that had chosen to dwell in the tents of Shem, not literally, but in her actions, dwelling in the tents of Shem, and takes a tent peg and puts it through the head of the captain of Canaan and makes him the lowest of servants. Tremendous example of what a sister can do, of what we can do as an ecclesia if we stand up for the things of the truth. So Jael lives out the prophecy of Noah. She dwelt among the tents of Shem. Her husband pitched his tent in the plain of Zaanaim, which means to move one's tent, and made peace with the Canaanites. God sold, as a slave, Sisera into Jael's hand, making him her servant. And then she made him the lowest of servants by nailing his head to the ground and crushing his head like the head of the serpent was crushed by Christ. And she is called of tent-dwelling women most blessed. In the New Testament, that phrase that she is most blessed among women is said of Mary by Gabriel. Turn with me to Luke chapter 1, verse 28. Because the angel recognizes the similarities in the role that Jael plays and that Mary's going to play in striking that blow as Jael did. Luke chapter 1, verse 28, it says, and the angel came in unto her and said, Hail, thou art highly favored. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. And Elizabeth repeats the same thing in the same chapter. Jael. What a tremendous example for us. So I think, brothers and sisters, what we've seen today, if we're going to wrap things up, is we've seen how important it is for us when the call comes for us to go out and to fight, to help our brothers and sisters, is for us to rise up as Barak did and to get started and to do the work. Deborah, she's the one that got the whole thing started in the first place and is a tremendous example of a teacher, of a judge, of someone that didn't just say, but also did. Of Barak, who leads captivity captive and leads his people out of their slavery to sin, just like Moses did and just like Christ did. Of the tribes that helped from all different walks of life who came and helped. And finally of Jael, who drives that final nail to drive his head into the ground and to crush him. It's up to us to make the decision where we're going to be in that song. The best place to be is among those that go and help and fight against Canaan. Thank you.